Surrounded by Germans, he made a choice no one expected. The war had already taken everything from him. Weeks of marching, days without proper food, nights filled with the sound of distant artillery. By the time the moment arrived, exhaustion had become normal, fear had become routine, and survival had become the only goal. But sometimes war forces a decision that goes far beyond survival. This was one of those moments. The situation that should have ended it all. It was late in the war when the patrol moved through a ruined stretch of countryside. The landscape around them barely resembled the world that had existed before the conflict. Burned houses stood like empty skeletons. Fields once used for farming had been torn apart by shells. Roads were broken and muddy from endless military movement. The soldier and the few men with him were trying to move quietly through the area. Their mission was simple: observe enemy movement and report back. Nothing heroic, nothing dramatic, just information. But war rarely allows simple missions to remain simple. As they moved through a narrow wooded path, the sound came first: boots. Then voices. German voices. Within seconds, it became clear that a large German unit was approaching from multiple directions. Patrols were spreading through the forest, checking the same routes the soldiers had planned to use for escape. The realization hit quickly. They were surrounded. Panic was the first instinct. One of the soldiers whispered that they should run. Another suggested hiding deeper in the woods. But both ideas had the same problem. German soldiers were everywhere. Running would make noise. Hiding might work for minutes, but not for long. Search patrols were methodical. Dogs were sometimes used. And once a group was discovered, mercy was rarely guaranteed. Every second mattered. The group looked toward the man who had quietly become their leader during the mission. He wasn't the highest-ranking officer. He wasn't famous. But in difficult moments, people naturally turn toward the person who remains calm. And he was calm. The decision that no one expected. Instead of running or hiding, he made a decision that shocked the others. He stood up. Not slowly, not cautiously. He simply stood up and stepped out from the trees. For a moment, the other soldiers thought exhaustion had broken his mind. Standing meant exposure. Exposure meant capture or worse. But he raised his hands and walked directly toward the approaching German patrol. The forest went silent behind him. The men watching from cover could barely breathe. They were convinced they had just witnessed the end of their mission, and possibly the end of his life. Why he took the risk. What the others did not yet understand was that he had been studying the German patrols carefully. For days he had watched how they moved, how they spoke to each other, how confident they appeared when they believed they had complete control. He knew something about human psychology in war. When soldiers believe they are winning, they expect enemies to hide, run, or fight. They do not expect someone to walk directly toward them. That moment of confusion could change everything, and confusion was exactly what he intended to create. The first seconds of contact. When the German patrol spotted him, rifles were raised immediately. Orders were shouted. He stopped walking, hands still raised. The officer leading the patrol stepped forward and demanded to know who he was. The soldier spoke calmly, not loudly, not nervously, just calmly. He began explaining that he had been separated from another unit during a nearby engagement. His story sounded rushed but believable, the kind of explanation that often happens in chaotic wartime situations. The German officer studied him carefully. The forest was quiet. For a moment, it felt like everything would collapse. The gamble begins to work. Something interesting happened during that conversation. The German officer lowered his weapon slightly. Not completely, but enough to show uncertainty. The patrol had expected to find hidden enemies. Instead, they found a lone soldier who appeared confused and exhausted. Suspicion remained, but certainty was gone. And uncertainty is dangerous in war because it slows decisions. That delay gave the hidden soldiers behind the trees exactly what they needed: time, the real purpose of the choice. While the conversation continued, the men hiding in the forest slowly began moving away from the area, carefully, quietly, one by one. Every second that the German officer remained distracted increased their chances of escape. The man standing in front of the patrol understood the risk perfectly. If the Germans realized the truth, he would be the first to pay for it. But he never showed fear. Instead, he continued speaking, calmly answering questions, maintaining the illusion that nothing unusual was happening. When the truth almost appeared. At one point, another German soldier began scanning the nearby woods more carefully. For a moment, it seemed like the entire plan would collapse. The man being questioned noticed the shift immediately. So he did something bold. He asked the German officer a question, a simple one, about the nearby unit headquarters. The unexpected question pulled the officer's attention back to the conversation, just long enough. By the time the patrol finally searched deeper into the woods, the rest of the group was already gone. The cost of the choice. Eventually, the German patrol realized something was wrong. Tracks in the mud, broken branches, evidence that more soldiers had been nearby. Their attention returned to the man standing in front of them. This time, the questioning became much harsher. But by then, the real objective had already been achieved. The others had escaped. The mission information would reach their command. And that moment of confusion he created made the difference. Why this story still matters. War is often remembered through massive battles and famous generals, but moments like this rarely appear in textbooks. One decision, one moment of courage, one person willing to risk everything so others could survive. That is where the real stories of war live. Surrounded by German soldiers, he could have chosen fear. Instead, he chose something no one expected. And that choice changed the outcome of that day forever. After the Germans realized what had happened, the atmosphere changed completely. The calm conversation from earlier was gone. Now the soldier was surrounded by armed men who knew they had been tricked. They searched him immediately, checking his pockets, his uniform, anything that could reveal who he really was or which unit he belonged to. In wartime, even a small piece of paper could expose an entire mission. But he had prepared for that possibility long before this moment. There were no maps, no written orders, nothing that could easily identify his team. The German officer looked frustrated. He had been fooled, and now he wanted answers. The questioning began right there in the forest. Where were the others? What unit are you with? Where are they going? The soldier gave almost nothing in return. Just simple responses, short explanations, enough to sound cooperative but never enough to reveal anything useful. A battle without weapons. Interrogation in war is a strange kind of battlefield. No guns, no explosions, but the pressure is just as intense. The officer tried different tactics. Sometimes he spoke calmly, pretending the situation was not serious. Other times, his voice became sharp and threatening. He hoped the prisoner would eventually panic and reveal something. But the soldier understood the situation clearly. The most dangerous mistake during interrogation is talking too much. So he stayed careful, every word measured, every answer controlled. He focused on one goal: give the enemy nothing that could harm the men who had escaped. The long march to a field post. After the questioning in the forest produced little information, the patrol decided to move him to a nearby field command post. They marched for hours, the muddy roads and damaged countryside. German vehicles occasionally passed by, trucks carrying supplies, wounded soldiers, or ammunition. The war machine was still moving, even as the situation across Europe was slowly turning against Germany. The soldier walked silently between guards. From time to time, he glanced at the surrounding landscape: burned houses, destroyed bridges, fields filled with shell craters. The war had transformed everything. But somewhere beyond that destruction, his fellow soldiers were moving farther away, carrying the information they needed. That thought alone made the risk worthwhile. Inside the temporary command post. The field command post was set up inside a damaged farmhouse near the road. Maps covered the walls. Radios crackled with constant reports from other units. Officers moved quickly from table to table, trying to keep track of changing battlefield conditions. The captured soldier was taken into a small room where another officer waited. This man was older, more experienced. His uniform carried the signs of someone who had spent years in the German army. He began questioning the prisoner again. This time, the approach was different. Instead of threats, the officer tried patience. He asked about the soldier's background, where he was from, how long he had been in the army. The questions seemed harmless, but their purpose was clear. The night in captivity. As evening fell, the farmhouse command post grew quieter. The constant movement of soldiers slowed. Radios still crackled in the other rooms, but the intense activity of the afternoon had faded into a tense silence. The prisoners sat alone on a wooden chair inside a small room with a single dim light hanging from the ceiling. Outside the door, 2 German guards stood watch. For the first time since the encounter in the forest, he finally had a moment to think. Not about fear, but about time. In war, time is often more valuable than weapons. Every hour that passed gave his fellow soldiers more distance, more safety, more opportunity to deliver their report and prepare for whatever operation might come next. And that thought alone made the situation easier to endure. The Germans still wanted answers. Later that night, the door opened again. The older German officer entered, carrying a small notebook. He pulled up a chair and sat across from the prisoner. This time, the questioning was slower and more deliberate. Instead of repeating the same questions, the officer began connecting details from earlier conversations. He mentioned the forest patrol, the footprints, the strange behavior of the man who had walked out of hiding. Then he asked a direct question. Why did you step out? For a moment, the room remained silent. It was an unusual question because it wasn't about military information. It was about the decision itself. The prisoner could have invented another story. He could have continued pretending that he was lost or separated from his unit. But instead, he simply said something simple. Someone had to. The officer stared at him for several seconds. In that moment, he likely understood the truth. The man sitting in front of him had sacrificed his own freedom so others could escape. And even in war, soldiers sometimes recognize courage, even in their enemies. A war already beginning to change. Outside the farmhouse, the larger war was moving in a direction the German army could no longer fully control. By this stage of World War II, Germany was facing enormous pressure on multiple fronts. Allied forces were advancing, supply lines were weakening, and the once unstoppable German war machine was beginning to show cracks. But soldiers in the field often didn't see the entire picture. They only saw the next mission, the next patrol, the next prisoner. For them, the war continued one small moment at a time. And tonight, that moment centered on the captured soldier sitting in the small farmhouse room. The possibility of transfer. The following morning brought new orders. German command posts often moved prisoners to larger facilities for longer interrogations. Officers trained specifically in intelligence gathering would take over questioning. The guards informed him that he might soon be transferred to another location. For many prisoners, that journey was the beginning of months, sometimes years, in prison camps. But the soldier remained focused on the one fact that mattered most. The mission had succeeded. Whatever happened next, the decision he made in the forest had already achieved its purpose. The soldiers who escaped never forgot. Days later, Far from that farmhouse, the men who escaped gathered with their commanding officers to discuss what had happened. They described the moment in the forest, the German patrol approaching, the sudden decision of their comrade to step out of hiding. At first, the officers listening to the story were stunned. It was the kind of action rarely written in official reports because it relied entirely on personal courage rather than formal orders. But the result was undeniable. The patrol routes had been exposed, enemy movements had been confirmed, and an important piece of intelligence had reached Allied command. One officer finally said something that captured the entire story. He saved the mission. The power of the unexpected. In war, strategy often focuses on numbers: more soldiers, more tanks, more weapons. But moments like this remind us that human decisions can sometimes matter as much as military strength. The German patrol expected enemies to hide or run. They expected fear. They did not expect a man to walk directly toward them and calmly start a conversation. That single unexpected decision changed the outcome of the encounter. And sometimes in war, surprise is the most powerful weapon of all. A story that lives beyond the battlefield. Years later, when the war finally ended, many stories of courage began to surface. Some involved massive battles, others described famous generals, but some of the most powerful stories were much quieter, moments where one person made a choice that protected others. This was one of those stories. Surrounded by German soldiers, facing almost certain capture, he made a decision that no one expected. He stepped forward, not to fight, not to escape, but to give others the chance to survive. And because of that choice, the mission and the men behind him lived on. What became of the soldier? The days after his capture passed slowly. The Germans kept him under guard, moving him between small temporary posts as the front lines continued shifting. Interrogations continued, but they produced little useful information. Every officer who questioned him eventually reached the same conclusion. He knew something, but he was not going to reveal it. In many cases during World War II, prisoners like him were eventually transferred to larger detention camps deeper behind the front lines. These camps held thousands of captured soldiers from different Allied armies. Life in those camps was difficult. Food was limited, conditions were harsh, and the uncertainty of the war made every day feel longer than the last. Yet, compared to the battlefield, the camps also meant something important: survival. For many captured soldiers, being held as a prisoner of war meant they had at least escaped the constant danger of artillery, air attacks, and frontline combat. The war outside the camp. While he remained in captivity, the war outside continued to move quickly. Across Europe, the balance of power was changing. Allied forces were advancing across multiple fronts. German units were being pushed back step by step, losing territory they had once conquered with speed and confidence. Supply shortages began to affect German troops. Fuel became scarce. Vehicles broke down more often. Communication between units grew more difficult. What had once seemed like an unstoppable military force was slowly weakening, and every new Allied advance brought one important possibility for prisoners held inside German camps: liberation. The day when everything changed. For months, the prisoner heard distant sounds of war. Sometimes it was artillery far away, sometimes the low rumble of aircraft passing overhead. The guards grew more nervous with each passing week. Rumors spread among prisoners that Allied forces were moving closer to the region. Then, one morning, the sound came again, but this time it was louder. Artillery explosions echoed in the distance. German soldiers rushed through the camp, shouting orders and moving equipment. Something major was happening. Within hours, the guards began to prepare to move prisoners away from the area. Many camps were evacuated during the final stages of the war as German forces tried to prevent prisoners from being freed by Allied advancing armies. But events were moving too fast.
Before the transfer could begin, Allied troops reached the area. The fighting around the camp was brief but intense, and when it ended, the gates were opened. For many prisoners, it was the first moment of real freedom they had experienced in months. Freedom after the war. When the soldier finally stepped outside the camp as a free man, the world looked very different from the one he had known before the war. Entire cities had been damaged or destroyed. Millions of people across Europe were trying to rebuild their lives after years of conflict. But for him, the most important thing was simple. He had survived. Eventually, he reunited with fellow soldiers and returned home. Stories of the war were shared slowly over time, sometimes with friends, sometimes with historians who wanted to understand what had happened during those chaotic years. Among those stories was the moment in the forest, the moment when he stepped out of hiding and walked directly toward a German patrol. Why his decision still matters. Many heroes of war are remembered because of large battles or famous victories, but sometimes the most powerful acts of courage happen in small, quiet moments that almost no one sees. A decision made in seconds, a risk taken without hesitation, a sacrifice made so others could escape. When the German patrols surrounded that forest path, most soldiers would have tried to run. He did something different. He stepped forward, and by doing so, he created the confusion that allowed his comrades to escape and complete their mission. The lesson from that moment. War is often described through weapons, strategies, and military strength. But stories like this remind us that wars are also shaped by individual choices. One person, one moment, one